Have you ever stopped to wonder what truly defines our environment? Is it only the trees, the rivers, and the skies above us? Or does it also extend to the air that slips silently into our lungs, the food we swallow without a thought, the water that slides across our tongues, and even the substances benign or perilous that we touch every day? In truth, the environment is not some distant abstraction, not a separate entity from us. It is the air swirling around our homes, the faint chemical haze drifting in factories, the dust we sweep from our tables, and the quiet but dangerous contaminants in the food and water we consume. This invisible, ever-present web is both our sustainer and, at times, our undoing. And herein lies the essence of environmental disease. These are not rare, exotic conditions confined to the pages of obscure medical journals. They are the silent companions of modern life disorders arising from the chemical and physical agents around us, and equally from the deficiencies and excesses of nutrition within us. The International Labor Organization reminds us, almost chillingly, that each year nearly 2.3 million people perish worldwide because of work-related illnesses and injuries. Can you imagine? That is more than the lives lost to road accidents and wars combined. Step back further, and you see that malnutrition, one of the most ancient and enduring scourges, still holds sway over nearly 800 million people. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. 1 in every 9 human beings on this planet is undernourished. And children, the most fragile among us, bear the brunt of it. Half of all childhood deaths can be traced back to the cruel hand of undernutrition. Such statistics are not cold numbers. They are cries echoing across continents, each a reminder that the environment in its broadest sense has the power to sculpt, sustain, or shatter health. When we speak of environmental factors, we must remember that they are not merely the smoke-stained skies over a city or the polluted rivers running through villages. They also include what might be called the personal environment, the choices we ourselves make, the cigarette one lights up in a moment of stress, the glass of alcohol raised too often at a dinner table, the recreational drug consumed in secrecy, the diet chosen each day. In wealthier nations, it is often this personal environment that inflicts the heavier toll. In poorer ones, it is the external environment, the ambient and occupational exposures, that grind down health. And yet, as the specter of global warming looms larger, even that balance may tilt. This chapter you now step into, dear listener, is not just another catalogue of diseases. It is a tour through the landscapes of our modern existence, where chemistry and biology collide with human behavior and where invisible hazards accumulate in air, soil, and water. And at the forefront of this journey stands a new, colossal adversary, climate change. Shall we confront it together? Health effects of climate change. Imagine standing on the shore of a vast ocean. The tide creeps higher than you remember from your childhood. Storms arrive with a ferocity that leaves villages flattened. Summers stretch on longer, hotter, unforgiving. Glaciers that once crowned mountains with dignity have retreated, bleeding into rivers at alarming speed. You may think this is poetic exaggeration, but it is, tragically, our reality. Since the dawn of the 20th century and with startling acceleration since the 1960s, the Earth has warmed. Record-breaking years have become the new normal. Between 2014 and 2018, the 5 hottest years ever recorded since 1880 occurred in relentless succession. Land temperatures soared, oceans warmed, sea levels crept upward by nearly 20 centimeters since 1900. Every fraction of a degree matters. Each whisper of a rise reshapes storms, floods, droughts, and disease patterns. But why is this happening? The answer, though politically debated, is scientifically unambiguous. The culprit is the greenhouse effect, intensified by human hands. Carbon dioxide once held in check by the lungs of our planet, the forests now saturates the air because we burn fossil fuels recklessly and cut down the very trees that could have saved us. Methane leaks from agriculture, ozone accumulates as a pollutant, and water vapor joins the chorus. Together, these gases trap the Earth's heat, refusing to let it escape into the cosmic night. The concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide, which hovered at levels unseen for 650,000 years, has now climbed past 410 parts per million. By the century's close, without intervention, it could rise to levels humanity has not witnessed in tens of millions of years. And what does this mean for health? The World Health Organization has issued sobering forecasts. Between 2030 and 2050, climate change alone could cause 250,000 additional deaths every single year, not from some mysterious new plague, but from old, familiar foes: heat waves, vector-borne diseases, malnutrition, diarrheal illnesses. Think about it, diseases that once belonged to specific latitudes are shifting, invading new territories as insects carrying malaria or dengue find warmer habitats. Crops once reliable wither under erratic rainfalls and unbearable heat, plunging vulnerable nations into hunger. Floods disrupt clean water supplies, spreading cholera and gastroenteritis in their wake. And the human heart, under the assault of scorching summers and polluted air, falters more often in strokes and infarcts. Picture the Maldive Islands, paradise to some, home to thousands. A rise of just half a meter in sea level will submerge most of them. Entire nations risk vanishing, and with them, the displacement of millions will ignite political unrest, war, and poverty, the fertile soil for malnutrition, epidemics, and despair. Isn't it striking, then, that the greatest environmental disease of our century may not be a toxin spilled in a river or a drug abused in a dark alley, but the collective warming of the planet itself, a slow, relentless fever consuming the only patient we all share, Earth? There is still hope, of course. In 2015, nearly 200 countries gathered in Paris, pledging to restrain this fever, to keep the rise in global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. Lofty promises were made, though political fractures and wavering commitments have since cast shadows on their fulfillment. Yet the science is clear: every ton of carbon avoided, every forest saved, every degree curtailed, translates not just into cooler summers but into lives preserved. So, when we think of climate change, let us not confine it to abstract charts and rising graphs. Let us recognize it as a looming public health emergency, a generator of strokes and heart attacks, of diarrheal diseases and childhood malnutrition, of anxiety, displacement, and death. Climate change is not tomorrow's story, it is today's unfolding tragedy. And as we step further into this chapter, keep this question close to your heart: if the very atmosphere that cradles us becomes toxic, if the very climate that nourished civilization turns hostile, where then shall humankind find refuge? With this in mind, let us now journey deeper. Having glimpsed the vast shadow of climate change, we turn next to the microscopic realm of toxic agents, the chemicals and poisons that seep into our lungs, our blood, our very cells. How do they twist the machinery of life? How do they transform a simple compound into a silent killer? The answers await in the science of toxicology. Section 2: Toxicity of Chemical and Physical Agents. What, after all, makes a substance poisonous? Is it the sinister nature of the molecule itself, or the quantity that slips past the body's defenses? A wise physician of the 16th century, Paracelsus, answered this riddle once and for all: all things are poison, and nothing is without poison, only the dose makes the poison. How profoundly true this remains, even in our era of sprawling laboratories and genetic insight. The science devoted to this question, to the study of poisons, of chemicals, of the unseen assassins in air, water, soil, and food, is called toxicology. At its heart lies a paradox: the very same molecule that heals at one concentration may kill at another. Digitalis, morphine, even humble aspirinol are lifelines in the right hands and deadly in excess. So, when we speak of environmental disease, we step into a world where dosage, timing, genetic makeup, and chance entwine to determine whether a substance is friend or foe. But how does the body, this fortress of cells and tissues, contend with the invasion of foreign agents? Consider a pollutant drifting in through the lungs, or a pesticide-laced fruit finding its way into the stomach. Such compounds, called xenobiotics, meaning foreign to life, can enter us through inhalation, ingestion, or even across the very surface of the skin. Once inside, they embark on a journey through the bloodstream, carried by lipoproteins, often aided by their lipophilic nature, slipping past cell membranes with disturbing ease. And here begins the alchemy of metabolism. Most xenobiotics, mercifully, do not remain in their original state. They are transformed by the body's chemical machinery into more water-soluble compounds, ready to be flushed out through urine or bile. This process unfolds in two great stages. The first, called phase I reactions, is a set of transformations: oxidation, reduction, hydrolysis that introduce or expose reactive groups. These products, still not harmless, are then swept into phase II reactions, where they are conjugated bound to molecules such as glucuronic acid, sulfate, methyl groups, or glutathione. Only then do they become water-loving and excretable, safe to leave the fortress of the body. But, like any defense, this system carries risk. Sometimes, instead of detoxification, the machinery crafts something more dangerous: a reactive metabolite, an unstable fragment capable of binding to proteins, lipids, even DNA itself. Imagine a craftsman meant to repair a wall who, in his zeal, leaves cracks that weaken the very foundation. Such is the peril of metabolic activation. At the center of this chemical theater stands a family of enzymes, cytochrome P-450. These heme-containing proteins, mostly nestled in the endoplasmic reticulum of hepatocytes, are our molecular workhorses. They oxidize, they reduce, they split apart compounds. Sometimes they render poisons harmless, detoxifying them into non-toxic metabolites. At other times, they create active demons out of dormant molecules. Carbon tetrachloride, once thought benign, becomes a free radical under their touch, ravaging liver cells. Benzopyrin, a smoky carcinogen from cigarettes, is transformed into a DNA-binding nightmare that seeds cancer in the lungs. Even the familiar acetaminophen, that friend for fevers and aches, in overdose is twisted by P-450 enzymes into a toxic metabolite that can silence the liver forever. Does this mean that everyone's fate is sealed equally when they encounter these toxins? Not at all. There is vast variability. Some of us carry genetic polymorphisms that render certain P-450 enzymes sluggish, while in others they race with hyperactivity. Our lifestyles too alter the tempo. Alcohol, smoking, and even certain drugs can induce these enzymes, making the body process xenobiotics differently, sometimes dangerously. Fasting, on the other hand, may diminish their activity. Thus, two people exposed to the same chemical cloud may walk away with wildly different outcomes, one unscathed, the other grievously ill. Consider also the byproducts of these metabolic duels. Reactive oxygen species, those tiny, furious sparks, emerge as side effects. They strike proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, carving lesions that the cell must frantically repair. Sometimes it succeeds, sometimes the injury is too deep, the DNA too scarred, the membrane too ruptured. Illness, then, is not simply the story of the poison, but the story of the battle between poison and repair. And what happens if repair fails? Short-term injuries may manifest as dizziness, nausea, confusion. Long-term consequences may take years to reveal themselves: cancers silently germinating, organ systems gradually crumbling under the weight of accumulated damage. Now pause and think. When regulators speak of safe limits for pollutants in air or water, what do they really mean? They speak in averages, in generalities, in limits meant for populations. But you, with your particular genes, with your unique exposures, may stand at greater risk than the average. A level tolerable to one may be ruinous to another. The complexity of toxicology lies precisely in this tension between the universal and the individual, between the theoretical safe dose and the unpredictable reality of human diversity. So the stage is set. We have understood how chemicals slip inside, how they are metabolized, how they may be neutralized or converted into lethal adversaries. With this knowledge, we can now open the next door in our exploration to see the myriad pollutants themselves, tangible villains of our daily air, water, and soil. What is this smog that cloaks cities in a veil of disease? How does carbon monoxide, invisible and odorless, become a silent executioner in garages and homes? And what of the heavy metals, glinting with menace, seeping through pipes and paints into the blood of children? The answers lie ahead as we descend from principles into particulars, from the science of poisons into the lived reality of pollution. Section 3. Environmental pollution. Air. It is the first thing we draw into our lungs at birth, and the last that escapes us when life departs. We seldom think of it, for it is invisible, odorless when pure, and ever present. Yet within this seemingly benign medium lurks one of the most insidious sources of disease: pollution. Air pollution is no recent invention. Even 4 centuries ago, a Londoner named John Evelyn lamented how the inhabitants of his city inhaled a thick mist that corroded lungs and shortened lives. King Edward I, centuries earlier, had issued a decree so blunt that it seems almost barbaric today: whoever was caught burning coal should lose his head. Such extremes hint at a truth we often forget: air has always been both sustainer and destroyer. Today, however, the forms of pollution have changed. Smog now is a cocktail of sulfur dioxide, ozone, nitrogen, oxides, carbon monoxide, lead, and particulate matter. Cities across the globe, Delhi, Beijing, Sao Paulo, Los Angeles, lie smothered under this haze. Each breath carries with it not only oxygen, but irritants, oxidants, and fine particles capable of inflaming airways and burdening hearts. Take ozone, for instance. High in the stratosphere, it is our guardian angel, shielding us from the lethal ultraviolet rays of the sun. But down here at ground level, ozone turns traitor. Born from the reaction of nitrogen, oxides, and volatile organic compounds in the presence of sunlight, this gas infiltrates the respiratory tract, generating free radicals that tear at the epithelial lining and alveoli. A healthy person may feel nothing more than chest tightness or fatigue after jogging on a smoggy day, but for the asthmatic, for the elderly with emphysema, every molecule of ozone is a dagger. Now add sulfur dioxide to this witch's brew. Born of coal and oil, of smelting furnaces and paper mills, it stings the nose, constricts the airways, and can collapse a vulnerable lung into spasm. Combine it with water vapor, and you conjure acid aerosols, microscopic drops of sulfuric acid that claw their way into bronchioles, leaving inflammation in their wake. And then there are the particulates, the soot we so casually brush off windowsills and car hoods. Do you know which particles are most dangerous? Not the larger specks that irritate the eyes, but the invisible, ultrafine fragments less than 10 microns across. These particles sink deep into the alveoli, where scavenger macrophages devour them and, in doing so, release storms of inflammatory mediators. The result is not only lung disease, bronchitis, exacerbations of asthma, but also a stealthy increase in heart attacks and strokes. Studies in American cities show that for every 10 micrograms per cubic meter rise in these fine particles, daily mortality creeps upward by 0.5%. It seems small, but across millions it translates into thousands of lives. Carbon monoxide deserves special mention. It is a deceiver, colorless, tasteless, odorless, giving no warning until it has already claimed its victim. Produced by incomplete combustion by car engines, faulty furnaces, smoldering charcoal, it kills by stealth. Why? Because hemoglobin, our carrier of life-giving oxygen, has 200 times more affinity for carbon monoxide than for oxygen. Once it binds, it refuses to let go, starving tissues of oxygen, even as the victim breathes normally. A person can sit in a closed garage with a running car and within minutes drift into coma and death, never realizing the danger. Even survivors of mild chronic exposure told booth attendants, tunnel workers, miners may carry the scars, headaches, memory lapses, neurological impairment. In acute cases, the telltale sign is eerie, a cherry-red discoloration of the skin and mucous membranes, masking the hypoxia beneath. It is the cruelest of disguises. But the story of pollution does not end with the open sky. Step indoors, and the danger is no less real. In many poorer regions of the world, families still cook with wood, dung, or coal, filling their small homes with smoke. The women and children who huddle close to the fires are bathed daily in oxides of carbon and nitrogen, in carcinogenic hydrocarbons, in particulate matter. The price is paid in chronic bronchitis, pneumonia, and lung cancer. In wealthier nations, the enemy takes subtler forms, volatile formaldehyde from furniture and adhesives, radon gas seeping silently from soil and rock foundations, allergens drifting in as dust mites, molds, and pet dander. Have you ever heard of the sick building syndrome? It is a curious affliction in which poorly ventilated modern offices leave their occupants with headaches, eye irritation, and fatigue not because of one single toxin, but because of an unseen mixture of them all. Radon, in particular, deserves our attention. Born from uranium in the Earth's crust, it seeps upward into homes, especially those poorly ventilated. Invisible, odorless, it lodges in the lungs where it irradiates tissues relentlessly. Among non-smokers, radon is the leading cause of lung cancer. Overall, it ranks second only to cigarettes themselves. Each year in the United States alone, radon is responsible for about 21,000 lung cancer deaths. Imagine deaths not from a dramatic explosion or chemical spill, but from a gas quietly emanating from beneath one's feet. Formaldehyde, too, is a subtle tormentor. Found in pressed wood furniture, cabinets, adhesives, and fabrics, it accumulates in tightly sealed rooms. At levels as low as 0.1 parts per million, it can sting eyes, burn throats, and trigger asthma attacks. Worse still, it has been recognized as a carcinogen in both humans and animals. Thus, whether outside in the choking smog of a metropolis or inside the comfort of our homes, pollution entwines itself with our breath. The very air we trust has become an accomplice in disease. But pause here and notice the pattern. In every story, from ozone to radon, from particulates to carbon monoxide, the lungs are the first to suffer. They are the frontiers, the exposed battlegrounds where the environment meets the body. The breath that sustains life is also the pathway through which invisible death may arrive. As we close this exploration of polluted air, let us shift our gaze downward into soil, into water, into the gleaming but treacherous realm of metals. For while gases and particulates assault us from the air, heavy metals seep silently into pipes, paints, crops, and ultimately into our bones and brains. What happens when lead paints the walls of a child's nursery? When mercury concentrates a millionfold in a fish that ends up on your plate? When arsenic poisons the wells of an entire village? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the lived realities of communities across the world, and in them lies our next journey, the tale of metals as environmental pollutants and the devastating imprint they leave upon human health. Section 4. Metals as environmental pollutants. Metals. What comes to your mind when you hear the word? Strength, wealth, the shine of gold, the sturdiness of iron. Civilization itself was once named after them, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. Yet woven into the same story is a darker narrative, metals as poisons. Unlike organic chemicals that decay and vanish, metals linger. They do not perish with time, they accumulate, infiltrating soil, water, food, and finally our bodies. Some, like iron and zinc, are essential in trace amounts, nourishing enzymes and sustaining life. But others, or even these same metals in excess, become treacherous. Let us begin with perhaps the most notorious, lead. Lead has been our companion for thousands of years. The Romans piped water through lead conduits, even sweetened wine with lead salts. Some historians whisper that the empire's very decline was hastened by lead poisoning among its elite. Whether true or not, lead remains today a silent specter in the lives of millions. Where does it come from? From paints that once colored our homes, from gasoline fumes in decades past, from plumbing, from batteries and industrial emissions. The child playing on the floor of a peeling old house inhales lead dust without knowing it. The worker in a battery plant, the mechanic handling used car parts, all become unknowing carriers of this toxic element. Once in the body, lead does not simply wash away. It binds to sulfhydryl groups in proteins, interfering with enzymes vital to heme synthesis. Picture the factory of red blood cells grinding to a halt, iron locked out, porphyrin precursors building up, basophilic stippling marking erythrocytes like tiny constellations under the microscope. The result: microcytic hypochromic anemia, the pallor of fatigue, the weakness of oxygen-starved tissues. But the damage does not end in the blood. In bones and teeth, lead nestles like an uninvited guest, substituting for calcium, laying down radiodense lines that X-rays betray in growing children. In the nervous system, the consequences are catastrophic. In adults, lead causes peripheral neuropathy, a wrist drop or foot drop from motor nerve injury. In children, whose brains are still sculpting themselves, the injury is merciless: lowered IQ, learning disabilities, seizures, even irreversible encephalopathy. Imagine the tragedy: a child's potential, forever stunted by a toxin inhaled at home. And as if this were not enough, lead also strikes the kidneys. Chronic exposure seeds interstitial fibrosis, tubular atrophy, and gout from impaired uric acid excretion, the so-called Saturnine gout, named after Saturn, the alchemical symbol for lead. Is there any safe level of lead? The chilling answer is no. Even blood lead levels, once thought harmless, are now recognized as dangerous, particularly in children. It is not just a poison, it is a thief of intellect, a slow saboteur of development. From lead we move to another metal, one that glimmers in liquid silver and whispers its poison through the oceans: mercury. For centuries, mercury was revered, even mystical. Alchemists sought immortality in its shimmer. Physicians prescribed it for syphilis before antibiotics existed. Today, however, we know it as a global pollutant raining down from coal-fired power plants, mining operations, and industrial discharges. Mercury exists in several forms: elemental, inorganic salts, and the most sinister, organic methylmercury. Methylmercury has a peculiar gift: it concentrates as it ascends the food chain. Tiny plankton absorb it from water, small fish eat the plankton, larger fish devour the smaller ones, and so on, until a tuna or swordfish holds in its flesh mercury levels thousands of times higher than the surrounding sea. And when that fish reaches your dinner plate, you inherit the poison. Mercury's favorite targets are the brain and the kidneys. In adults, inhalation of vapor may cause tremors, gingivitis, and behavioral disturbances, the so-called Mad Hatter syndrome, a relic of workers in felt hat factories exposed to mercury salts. But the most devastating effects are seen in developing fetuses. Pregnant women who consume mercury-laden fish risk bearing children with cerebral palsy, deafness, blindness, and severe developmental delays. The tragedy of Minamata Bay in Japan is a haunting testament. In the 1950s, industrial effluents loaded with methylmercury contaminated local waters, and the population who fed on the fish suffered horrendous neurological disease, still remembered today as Minamata disease. Mercury binds to sulfhydryl groups, disrupting proteins, and generates free radicals that rip through membranes and DNA. Its legacy is one of tremor, ataxia, sensory loss, and irreversible brain injury. No wonder the world now strives to limit its emissions through treaties and bans, yet the danger persists, lingering in oceans and rivers like a silver ghost. Now, let us turn to arsenic, the king of poisons, a substance so infamous that its mere name conjures images of murder mysteries and sinister plots. But arsenic is no fiction. It seeps naturally from the earth into groundwater, contaminating wells across South Asia, including millions in Bengal and Bangladesh. Industrial processes, herbicides, and pesticides add to its spread. Arsenic, when ingested, disrupts mitochondrial respiration, crippling cellular energy production. In acute poisoning, it brings nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and even cardiovascular collapse. But the more insidious threat is chronic exposure through drinking water. Over years, the skin begins to change: hyperpigmentation mottled with depigmented patches, keratosis thickening palms and soles, and an unmistakable predisposition to cancers of skin, lungs, and bladder. The cancers, cruelly, may arise decades after exposure, long after the wells were first dug. Microscopically, arsenic alters keratinocyte proliferation, while at the molecular level it induces genetic mutations and epigenetic changes. Entire villages have been marked by its scourge, the water they trusted becoming their betrayer. Few environmental toxins so vividly illustrate how geology, poverty, and public health intertwine in tragedy. Finally, we come to cadmium, perhaps less infamous than lead or mercury, yet no less destructive. Cadmium is a child of modern industry, released from mining, smelting, batteries, and fertilizers. Plants absorb it from soil, and so it enters the food chain: leafy vegetables, cereals, even tobacco leaves. Smokers therefore inhale cadmium with every puff. Once inside, cadmium prefers the kidneys and lungs. Chronic exposure scars renal tubules, causing proteinuria, progressive renal failure, and loss of calcium, leading to osteoporosis and osteomalacia. In Japan, one village's population consumed rice grown in cadmium-contaminated soil, leading to a devastating epidemic of brittle bones and fractures known as Itai disease, named after the mournful cry of sufferers, "It hurts, it hurts." Cadmium also inflames the lungs, causing obstructive lung disease and raising the risk of lung cancer. At the molecular level, it generates reactive oxygen species, disrupts DNA repair, and alters gene expression, a slow corrosive influence on the machinery of life. Thus, lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, four names that together compose a grim litany of environmental disease. Each tells a different story: the child stunted by lead, the fisherman's family stricken by mercury, the villagers scarred by arsenic, the rice farmers crippled by cadmium. Different poisons, different geographies, yet a single theme: the metals that built civilization now corrode its health. And yet, as we step back from this metallic gallery, one question beckons: what of the men and women who, in the very course of their labor, face exposures to dusts, solvents, fibers, and fumes every day, not by accident, not by polluted water or tainted fish, but by the very nature of their occupation? To understand this is to enter the realm of occupational health, our next destination on this journey. Section 5: Occupational Health Risks, Industrial and Agricultural Exposures. Close your eyes and picture a miner, lamp on his helmet, descending into the dark veins of the earth. Imagine a farmhand stooped in the fields, spraying crops with pesticides as the wind drifts the mist back onto his skin. Think of a worker in a textile mill, inhaling fibers day after day. These are not rare or exotic images, they are daily realities for millions across the globe. And with each breath, each touch, each shift at work, they acquire more than wages, they acquire risk. Occupational exposure is as old as human industry itself. Hippocrates described the diseases of miners. Bernardino Ramazzini, in the 17th century, wrote of ailments among craftsmen and laborers, and is today remembered as the father of occupational medicine. Yet in our modern world, where industrialization has multiplied exponentially, the hazards have only expanded in variety and consequence. Let us begin with pneumoconiosis, a family of lung diseases born of inhaled dusts. Coal dust, silica, asbestos, each tells a different tale, but all culminate in scarring of the lungs. Coal miners inhaling fine coal particles day after day may develop coal workers' pneumoconiosis. The lungs, once pink, turn black and heavy, marred by fibrosis. Some cases remain mild, but others progress to massive scarring, respiratory insufficiency, and death. Silica, abundant in the Earth's crust, is even more treacherous. Sandblasters, stone cutters, foundry workers inhale crystalline silica, and over time, nodules of fibrosis form in their lungs. Unlike some other pneumoconioses, silicosis carries another sinister gift: it predisposes strongly to tuberculosis. The dust that built civilization's monuments also etched disease into the bodies of those who carved them. Asbestos, once hailed as the miracle fiber for its fireproof qualities, has left perhaps the deadliest legacy. Shipyard workers, construction laborers, insulation handlers, all were exposed. The fibers lodged deep in the lungs, refusing to leave. Decades later, they may seed asbestosis, a crippling interstitial fibrosis, or even more lethal, mesothelioma, a malignancy of the pleura. Add cigarette smoke to this exposure, and the risk of lung cancer multiplies astronomically. But occupational hazards do not end with dust. Consider organic solvents and chemical fumes. Benzene, a sweet-smelling solvent, is linked irrevocably to aplastic anemia and acute myeloid leukemia. Vinyl chloride, used in the plastics industry, scars the liver with angiosarcoma, a cancer once almost unheard of until industry created it. Agricultural workers spraying organophosphate pesticides may suffer acute cholinergic crises, sweating, convulsions, respiratory failure, or chronic neurological impairments that linger long after the fields are harvested. In metalworking shops, hexavalent chromium induces lung cancer. In battery plants, as we have already seen, lead poisons workers relentlessly. In gold mines, mercury vapor claims its toll. Even in cotton and flax mills, the simple act of inhaling vegetable fibers produces bisonosis, a Monday morning asthma where the week begins with coughing spasms and chest tightness. And then there are biological hazards. Healthcare workers are daily exposed to hepatitis viruses, HIV, and now novel pathogens. Farmers meet zoonoses through livestock. Waste handlers encounter parasites. Occupation becomes not only a means of survival, but a door through which microbes walk freely into human hosts. The story does not end in acute poisonings and infections. Some exposures linger silently, reshaping cells until cancers bloom decades later. Mesothelioma from asbestos, leukemia from benzene, liver angiosarcoma from vinyl chloride. Each is an epitaph carved not immediately, but long after the first breath of dust or whiff of fumes. Pause here and reflect. These diseases are not accidents in the truest sense. They are preventable. With protective equipment, with regulation, with awareness, countless lives could be spared. Yet, in many corners of the world, safety remains a luxury. Workers still toil, without masks, without ventilation, without legal safeguards. The price of cheap goods, cheap energy, cheap food is too often paid in human lungs, livers, and blood. And so, occupational diseases form the dark mirror of human progress. The very work that sustains us, that builds cities and feeds nations, also plants the seeds of illness. From the black lungs of miners to the cancers of factory workers, the story is universal. But our journey does not pause here. If industrial dusts and fumes erode health, so too does another, more familiar exposure, one that is voluntary, chosen by millions each day. It is not the product of occupation, but of personal environment. A small roll of dried leaves, ignited at one end, inhaled at the other. Tobacco. Perhaps the most preventable cause of disease and death known to humankind. And it is there that our narrative now turns. Section 6: Effects of Tobacco. Picture it, a man lights a cigarette on a quiet street corner. The ember glows, the smoke curls upward, he inhales deeply. To him it may be a moment of calm, a ritual repeated countless times. But inside his body, a storm is unfolding. Each puff delivers thousands of chemicals, some irritants, some addictive, and dozens proven carcinogens. In that gentle plume of smoke lies a weapon capable of scarring arteries, blackening lungs, and twisting DNA into malignant shapes. Tobacco's reign is staggering. It claims more than 5 million lives every year, a number so vast that it dwarfs the mortality of many infectious epidemics. And yet, its danger is often underestimated because it is self-inflicted, wrapped in choice and habit. But what truly happens when smoke enters the body? Let us begin with the lungs, the first battleground. Tobacco smoke contains polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and nitrosamines, chemicals that intercalate into DNA, spawning mutations that open the door to cancer. It also houses phenols that irritate, aldehydes that inflame, and carbon monoxide that strangles oxygen delivery. The ciliated epithelium lining the bronchi, those delicate sweepers of debris, are paralyzed and eventually destroyed. What replaces them is squamous epithelium, tough but defenseless against carcinogens. Thus arises squamous metaplasia, a precursor to carcinoma. With chronic exposure, the lungs develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. Chronic bronchitis emerges when smoke stimulates excess mucus production and disables ciliary clearance, filling airways with sticky phlegm. Emphysema follows as smoke-induced inflammation destroys alveolar walls, leaving behind cavernous spaces and a diminished surface for gas exchange. The result is the archetypal smoker's breathlessness, the wheeze, the chronic cough, the inexorable march toward respiratory failure. But the lungs are only the opening chapter. Tobacco's tendrils extend into the cardiovascular system, where nicotine plays its cunning role. This alkaloid, highly addictive, stimulates the release of catecholamines, raising heart rate, blood pressure, and myocardial oxygen demand. Meanwhile, the carbon monoxide in smoke reduces oxygen delivery. The combination primes the heart for ischemia. Smokers suffer heart attacks, strokes, and peripheral vascular disease at rates 2 to 4 times higher than non-smokers. Imagine the cruel irony. The same smoke that inflates the chest with pleasure narrows the arteries until they starve. Then comes the cancerous cascade. Cigarette smoke is not selective in its malevolence. It seeds malignancies from lips to larynx, from pancreas to kidney, from bladder to cervix. Why so widespread? Because carcinogens are not confined to the lungs, they dissolve in saliva, in swallowed smoke, in the bloodstream, traveling wherever they please. The bladder, for instance, is a favorite site because aromatic amines in smoke are excreted through urine, bathing the urothelium in mutagens. In men, tobacco accounts for 90% of lung cancers, in women, about 80%. Yet, lung cancer is only the apex of the pyramid. Oral cancers, esophageal carcinomas, pancreatic adenocarcinomas, all traceable to smoke. And let us not forget the synergy with alcohol. In heavy drinkers who also smoke, the risk of oropharyngeal and laryngeal cancers does not merely add, it multiplies. The two poisons act in concert, one a solvent enhancing mucosal penetration of carcinogens, the other the carcinogen itself. But perhaps the most sinister cruelty of tobacco lies in its impact on the innocent, the non-smokers forced into proximity with smokers. Passive smoking or environmental tobacco smoke contains the same toxic mixture inhaled by the active smoker. Children exposed at home suffer more respiratory infections, asthma attacks, and sudden infant death. Adults see their risks of heart disease and lung cancer climb. There is no safe threshold of exposure. A single cigarette smoked in a room can leave behind carcinogenic particles for hours. And then there is the question of addiction. Why, knowing its dangers, do people continue? Because nicotine hijacks the brain's reward pathways. It releases dopamine, weaving pleasure and dependence into each puff. The body adapts, tolerance develops, withdrawal looms when smoking ceases, irritability, anxiety, hunger, insomnia. It is not weakness of will, it is chemistry, biology, a dependence as powerful as any narcotic. The tragedy is intergenerational. Pregnant women who smoke pass on harm to their unborn children, low birth weight, spontaneous abortions, preterm labor, even sudden infant death syndrome after birth. Infants who begin life with such handicaps may suffer lifelong consequences, all because of exposure in utero. Yet, amid this grim landscape, there is hope. The moment one quits, the body begins its repair. Within weeks, circulation improves. Within months, lung function rises. Within a year, the risk of coronary disease drops significantly. The longer one stays abstinent, the more the risks retreat, though lung cancer risk never quite returns to baseline. Every day, without smoke is a reclamation of health, a defiance against the decades of manipulation by the tobacco industry. Still, tobacco remains entrenched in culture, glamorized in films, marketed cunningly despite regulations. Its grip is strongest where awareness and regulation are weakest, often in poorer countries where its burden of disease continues to grow. Reflect on this. Tobacco is the only legal consumer product that, when used as intended, kills half of its regular users. Few truths in medicine are so stark. So, from the smoldering tip of a cigarette radiates a network of consequences: pulmonary devastation, cardiovascular peril, malignancies across the body, harm to unborn children, injury to bystanders. It is a single habit with tentacles in every organ system, a kingpin in the pantheon of preventable diseases. And as we set down this story of smoke, another intoxicant waits in the shadows, one perhaps more socially accepted, even celebrated in ritual and festivity. It flows in glasses, warms the blood, loosens tongues, and yet, when consumed in excess, it etches its ruin across liver, brain, and heart. I speak, of course, of alcohol. Section 7. Effects of alcohol. From the vineyards of Rome to the taverns of medieval Europe, from the rice wines of Asia to the distilled spirits of modern bars, alcohol has always been more than a drink. It is a symbol of fellowship, an agent of escape, a lubricant of social bonds. Yet behind the convivial laughter and clinking glasses, alcohol conceals a pharmacological truth. It is a drug, a central nervous system depressant, and, in excess, a toxin of staggering potency. Let us start at the beginning with its metabolism. When a person drinks, ethanol is absorbed quickly from the stomach and small intestine, diffusing freely across membranes. Almost all of it is processed in the liver, where two enzymatic systems bear the burden. The first and most important is alcohol dehydrogenase ADH, which converts ethanol into acetaldehyde, a highly reactive and toxic compound. Acetaldehyde is then further oxidized by aldehyde dehydrogenase ALD into acetate, a less harmful metabolite that can be used in metabolic pathways. The second system is the microsomal ethanol oxidizing system MeOs, primarily via cytochrome P-450 enzymes, particularly CYP-CoE. With heavy drinking, MeOs becomes more active, leading not only to faster clearance of alcohol but also to the generation of reactive oxygen species that damage cellular components. Acetaldehyde, that fleeting intermediate, deserves special condemnation. It binds to proteins, forming adducts that interfere with enzyme activity and immune recognition. It is responsible for flushing, tachycardia, nausea, the unpleasant symptoms some individuals, especially those of East Asian descent with ALD polymorphisms, know all too well. But beyond discomfort, acetaldehyde also seeds fibrosis, mutagenesis, and carcinogenesis. The third villain in the metabolic story is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide NAD+, consumed voraciously during ethanol oxidation. As NAD+ is depleted and converted to NAD, the balance of hepatic metabolism tips. Fatty acid oxidation slows, triglyceride synthesis accelerates, and fat accumulates in hepatocytes. Thus begins the spectrum of alcoholic liver disease, from fatty change to hepatitis to cirrhosis. But before we march through the liver's pathologies, let us pause and examine alcohol's systemic reach. What happens to the body and mind with acute ingestion? In small amounts, ethanol loosens social restraint, blunts anxiety, and induces euphoria. But as blood alcohol concentration rises, it impairs judgment, coordination, and reaction time. At 200 mg/dl, most individuals are clearly intoxicated, with slurred speech and staggering gait. At 300 to 400 mg/dl, stupor and coma ensue. Beyond 500 mg/dl lies the threshold of respiratory arrest and death. The line between celebration and catastrophe is thinner than many realize. Chronic alcohol use, however, is where the most insidious damage occurs. Let us return to the liver, the battlefield where ethanol's assault is most relentless. At first, there is hepatic steatosis, fatty liver. The organ becomes enlarged, yellow, greasy, yet this stage is reversible with abstinence. But persistence in drinking kindles alcoholic hepatitis, hepatocyte swelling and necrosis, Mallory-Denk bodies of tangled cytocratin, neutrophilic infiltration, and fibrotic scarring. Clinically, the patient manifests with jaundice, fever, tender hepatomegaly, and deranged liver function tests. A subset of these cases progresses to cirrhosis, the end-stage architecture of shrunken, nodular, fibrotic liver. Cirrhosis, in turn, sets the stage for portal hypertension, variceal bleeding, ascites, hepatic encephalopathy, and hepatocellular carcinoma. Thus, from steatosis to carcinoma, alcohol crafts a continuum of destruction, each step preventable, each step tragic. But the story widens. Alcohol also afflicts the gastrointestinal tract. It irritates the gastric mucosa, producing gastritis and ulcers. It increases the risk of cancers of the oral cavity, pharynx, larynx, esophagus, and colon, particularly when combined with tobacco. In the pancreas, it causes both acute and chronic pancreatitis, leading to malabsorption, diabetes, and excruciating abdominal pain. In the cardiovascular system, alcohol is a double-edged sword. In modest amounts, it may raise HDL cholesterol and confer a small protective effect against coronary artery disease. But chronic heavy drinking damages myocardium directly, leading to dilated cardiomyopathy with heart failure. Hypertension is more common, arrhythmia is more frequent, strokes more deadly. The protective whispers of red wine are drowned in the roar of excess. The nervous system too pays its toll. Ethanol is neurotoxic. Chronic consumption causes peripheral neuropathy, with numbness, tingling, and weakness. The brain shrinks under the combined insult of direct toxicity and nutritional deficiency. Deficiency of thiamine, often due to alcohol's interference with absorption and metabolism, produces Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, confusion, ataxia, ophthalmoplegia, followed by profound memory loss and confabulation. In children born to mothers who drink, fetal alcohol syndrome is among the most devastating legacies, growth retardation, microcephaly, facial anomalies, and neurodevelopmental impairment that shadows the child for life. One cannot speak of alcohol without mentioning its role in social and accidental injuries. Drunken driving kills thousands yearly. Domestic violence, workplace accidents, and drownings multiply under its influence. The public health cost is measured not only in cirrhosis admissions, but in broken families, lost productivity, and wasted potential. Yet, as with tobacco, the narrative is not unrelievedly bleak. Abstinence can halt and sometimes reverse early liver disease. Risk of cancer declines with years of sobriety. Support, counseling, and medical interventions, disulfiram, naltrexone, acamprosate, offer hope to those caught in dependence. The struggle, however, is formidable, for alcohol, like nicotine, binds not only to receptors in the brain, but to rituals in society and identity itself. Thus, alcohol emerges as paradox, celebrated libation and insidious toxin, joy-bringer and life-taker. A symbol of culture, yet also a destroyer of lives. And now, having considered the toxins that enter by choice tobacco smoke, alcoholic drink, let us turn to something more elusive, yet equally treacherous, the drugs and chemicals we encounter in the name of medicine and recreation. What of therapeutic agents that heal in one dose yet harm in another? What of illicit drugs, heroin, cocaine, that seduce with euphoria and leave only ruin? This is the realm we must now enter, the next frontier in our exploration of environmental diseases. Section 8. Therapeutic drugs and drug abuse. Let us begin with therapeutic drugs, the kind we find in pharmacies and hospitals, prescribed by physicians, often life-saving. One would imagine that such agents, tested and regulated, should be free of menace. Yet, medicine is rarely so simple. Take the humble acetaminophen paracetamol. At therapeutic doses, it soothes pain and reduces fever without much danger. But in overdose, it becomes a silent assassin. The liver, in metabolizing acetaminophen, usually conjugates it to harmless forms. However, a fraction is oxidized by cytochrome P-450 into a toxic metabolite, an acetyl P-benzoquinonamine NAPI. Normally, glutathione in hepatocytes neutralizes NAPI. But in overdose, glutathione is depleted and NAPI binds covalently to cellular proteins, initiating massive hepatic necrosis. The patient may appear well in the first day, only to slip into jaundice, coagulopathy, and fulminant liver failure by the third. A tragic tale of how a trusted medicine, when misused, can mimic the deadliness of a poison. Then there is aspirin, the archetypal salicylate. Its virtues are many: analgesic, antipyretic, antiplatelet. But in overdose, aspirin unravels the delicate acid-base balance. At first, it stimulates the respiratory center, causing respiratory alkalosis. Soon, however, it uncouples oxidative phosphorylation, leading to metabolic acidosis. Hyperthermia, dehydration, coma, and death may follow. In children, even therapeutic doses can precipitate Rey syndrome, fatty liver, and encephalopathy when given during viral illnesses. Thus, a simple tablet carries within it a Janus face of healing and harm. Anti-cancer drugs embody this duality most starkly. They are designed to kill cells, and indeed they do both malignant and healthy. Doxorubicin may cure leukemias, yet scar the heart with irreversible cardiomyopathy. Cyclophosphamide treats lymphomas yet causes hemorrhagic cystitis. Methotrexate halts rapidly dividing cells but leaves behind bone marrow aplasia and mucosal ulcerations. These are acceptable poisons, tolerated because they offer a chance against cancer, yet leaving survivors with burdens of secondary disease. Even antibiotics, our supposed miracle drugs, can wound. Aminoglycosides may save a life from sepsis but render the patient deaf or nephropathic. Chloramphenicol, once widely used, was found to trigger aplastic anemia. Tetracyclines stain the teeth of children, and fluoroquinolones can rupture tendons. We are reminded that every pill is a trade, benefit weighed against risk. Hormonal therapies, too, illustrate this paradox. Oral contraceptives, empowering women with control over reproduction, also increase the risk of venous thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, and, in rare cases, hepatic adenomas. Estrogen replacement therapy alleviates menopausal symptoms but elevates the risk of breast cancer and cardiovascular events. Medicine is rarely black or white. It is a chiaroscuro of light and shadow. Having traversed the world of therapeutic agents, let us now confront their darker cousins, the illicit drugs. Foremost among them is cocaine, the crystalline alkaloid of the coca leaf. Its action is swift, euphoric, electrifying. It blocks the reuptake of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, amplifying their effects in synapses. The user feels invincible, ecstatic, full of energy. But beneath this surge lies peril. Cocaine constricts blood vessels, raises blood pressure, and accelerates the heart. It primes the myocardium for arrhythmias, infarctions, and sudden death. In the brain, it can rupture vessels, unleashing hemorrhagic stroke. Chronic use erodes the nasal septum, causes seizures, and induces psychosis indistinguishable from schizophrenia. For pregnant women, it strangles the placenta's blood flow, leading to miscarriage or growth-retarded infants. The ecstasy of cocaine is but a brief prelude to its cruelty. Next is heroin, an opiate derived from morphine, injected, snorted, or smoked for its intense euphoria. But heroin binds with chains stronger than steel, for it latches onto opioid receptors in the brain, flooding them with pleasure while suppressing respiration. Overdose deaths are often peaceful in appearance. The user simply stops breathing. Long-term users develop collapsed veins, infections of heart valves, lung abscesses, and blood-borne diseases like HIV and hepatitis from shared needles. Withdrawals are agonizing chills, vomiting, muscle pain, craving that tears at the soul. Heroin transforms the body into a battleground and the life around it into wreckage. Methamphetamine and related stimulants offer a different lure: heightened alertness, weight loss, sexual arousal, confidence. Yet they scorch the nervous system. Dopamine stores are depleted, neurons damaged irreversibly, leaving behind anxiety, violent behavior, paranoia, and eventually cognitive decline. The meth mouth with rotting teeth and the emaciated body of a chronic user are outward signs of the devastation within. Cannabis, more widely used and often considered benign, is not without consequence. Its active ingredient, THC, binds to cannabinoid receptors, altering perception, mood, and coordination. In modest doses, its harms may be subtle, but chronic heavy use impairs memory, concentration, and in vulnerable individuals triggers psychosis. Inhaled as smoke, It carries carcinogens similar to tobacco. Its full spectrum of long-term effects remains under study, but the image of harmlessness is more myth than certainty. Then there are the club drugs ecstasy, MDMA, hallucinogens, inhalants, each with their own peculiar hazards. Ecstasy floods neurons with serotonin, producing euphoria and empathy, but may also cause hyperthermia, dehydration, and neuronal injury. Hallucinogens warp perception, sometimes permanently unhinging the mind. Inhalants like glue or nitrous oxide suffocate neurons, leaving behind brain atrophy and sudden death. The common thread among all illicit drugs is the chasm between initial pleasure and eventual ruin. They offer escape, but the escape becomes a prison guarded by withdrawal, tolerance, and craving. And yet, perhaps the most sobering truth is this: both therapeutic drugs and illicit substances remind us that chemistry cares nothing for morality. A molecule may heal or harm depending on dose, context, and intent. The same opioid molecule may be morphine in a hospital, soothing the pain of a dying patient, or heroin on the street, ending the life of a young user. As we close this section, we stand at a crossroad. We have seen pollutants in the air, poisons in metals, dust in occupations, toxins in tobacco and alcohol, and now the peril of drugs both legal and illegal. But what of a subtler, more pervasive influence, something not inhaled or swallowed, but absorbed in silence, through invisible waves? What of environmental and occupational exposures to ionizing radiation, whose energy itself tears DNA, leaving mutations and malignancy in its wake? That is the path to which we now turn. Section 9. Injuries produced by ionizing radiation. Imagine this: a physician in the late 19th century leans over his hand, curious, as X-rays are first discovered. Hours later, a burn blossoms on his skin. Weeks later, an ulcer. Decades later, cancer. From the very birth of radiology, humankind has known both the promise and peril of ionizing radiation. Radiation, by definition, is energy in motion. But not all radiation is the same. Non-ionizing radiation like microwaves or radio waves agitates molecules, but rarely breaks them. Ionizing radiation, however, carries enough energy to eject electrons from atoms, creating ions. This simple act, stripping an electron, unleashes a cascade of biological havoc. Where does this radiation come from? Some from the natural world: cosmic rays, radon gas, radioactive isotopes in soil. Some from human endeavors: medical imaging and therapy, nuclear power, industrial sources, and weapons. Whatever the source, the damage it inflicts upon the body is shaped by dose, rate, distribution, and tissue sensitivity. When ionizing radiation strikes living tissue, it acts in two principal ways. It may directly break bonds within DNA, severing strands and mutating bases. Or it may indirectly split water molecules into reactive free radicals, hydroxyl radicals, hydrogen peroxide, that in turn attack DNA, proteins, and membranes. Double-strand breaks in DNA are particularly devastating, often irreparable, sowing the seeds of apoptosis, senescence, or carcinogenesis. But how does this translate clinically? The spectrum of radiation injury is vast, ranging from acute sickness to chronic scarring to cancers decades later. Let us begin with deterministic effects, those that appear above a threshold dose and worsen with increasing exposure. The skin, constantly renewing, shows early signs: erythema, blistering, ulceration, even necrosis with high doses. The gastrointestinal tract, with its rapidly dividing crypt cells, succumbs next: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, hemorrhage. The bone marrow, cradle of blood cells, is exquisitely sensitive. At moderate exposures, leukopenia emerges; at higher exposures, pancytopenia, infection, and bleeding. And when the whole body is bathed in radiation, a grim picture unfolds: the acute radiation syndrome. At doses of 1 to 2 Gray, bone marrow failure dominates, leading to infection and hemorrhage. At 5 to 10 Gray, the gastrointestinal tract collapses, crypt cells perish, mucosa sloughs, sepsis overwhelms. Above 20 Gray, The central nervous system itself falters, confusion, ataxia, seizures, coma, death within hours. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Chernobyl. These names remind us not only of geopolitical events but of the biological consequences of total body irradiation. Yet radiation's cruelty is not confined to the acute. There are stochastic effects, those without threshold, where any dose, however small, may increase risk. Chief among these is carcinogenesis. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki displayed higher rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, breast cancer, and lung cancer. Workers exposed to radon gas in uranium mines bore excess lung cancer. Children irradiated for thymic enlargement or scalp ringworm developed thyroid tumors decades later. Radiation does not guarantee cancer, but it tips the dice in malignancy's favor. Tissue sensitivity varies. The gonads are exquisitely vulnerable. Even modest doses impair spermatogenesis, and higher exposures obliterate oocytes, causing sterility. In pregnant women, fetal tissues are at risk of growth retardation, microcephaly, intellectual disability, and increased cancer. The thyroid, hungry for iodine, avidly takes up radioactive isotopes, making it a frequent target of fallout exposure. And then there are the fibrotic sequelae. Radiation injures microvasculature, thickens intima, narrows lumina. Over time, ischemia and fibrosis cripple organs. The lung stiffens with interstitial fibrosis. The bowel narrows with strictures. The skin scars, hair follicles die, glands wither. Radiation therapy, while often life-saving against tumors, leaves behind these chronic footprints in normal tissue. Dose is critical. Below 100 millisieverts, effects may be subtle, statistical, detectable only across populations. Between 1 and 2 sieverts, illness becomes manifest. At higher doses, death is near certain. But dose is not the only measure. Dose rate matters too. A single blast differs from the same dose spread gently over time, for repair mechanisms have room to operate in the latter. Here lies the paradox of radiation in medicine. The same X-rays that diagnose fractures may sow seeds of malignancy. The same beams that destroy a cancer may scar healthy lung or myocardium. It is the archetype of double-edged sword, an enemy when uncontrolled, an ally when disciplined. Hence the doctrine of radioprotection: minimize exposure, shield patients, limit dose, always weigh benefit against risk. Consider this: the average person, even without medical exposure, absorbs about 2 to 3 millisieverts of radiation annually from natural sources: radon in homes, cosmic rays in the sky, radionuclides in food and water. Add to this the medical imaging of modern life: CT scans, fluoroscopy, and the tally may rise severalfold. Radiation is not an exotic hazard, it is woven into daily existence. Let us not forget also the psychological legacy of radiation accidents. After Chernobyl, thousands lived in fear of invisible contamination. After Fukushima, the trauma of evacuation, stigma, and uncertainty rivaled the physical injuries. Radiation thus inflicts wounds on mind as well as body. To summarize this panorama, radiation burns, blisters, and kills outright in large doses. It suppresses marrow, shreds intestines, and silences neurons in acute syndrome. It scars and fibroses organs in the long term. It reshapes DNA, scattering mutations that decades later emerge as leukemia or thyroid cancer. It spares no system, though some are more sensitive than others. And now, having examined the elemental force of radiation, we must turn to another vast domain: nutrition. For while radiation strikes from without, nutrition shapes us from within. Too little or too much food, imbalances in vitamins and minerals, excesses of fat and sugar, these, too, are diseases of environment, though of a more quotidian kind. From marasmus and kwashiorkor to obesity and metabolic syndrome, the story of nutrition is the story of survival and society. That is the final journey that awaits us in this chapter. Section 10: Nutritional Diseases. Let us begin with a simple truth: every human life is tethered to nourishment. Food is not merely fuel, it is the raw material of our flesh, the energy for our thoughts, the defense of our immune system. And yet, paradoxically, in a world brimming with food abundance in some regions and desolation in others, malnutrition exists side by side with obesity. Protein energy malnutrition. At one pole lies protein energy malnutrition PM, the cruel face of deprivation. It manifests most starkly in children of impoverished lands, where hunger is not an occasional pang, but a constant companion. Two archetypal syndromes reveal its extremes: marasmus and kwashiorkor. Marasmus is the body's desperate attempt to survive when calories of all kinds are insufficient. The child becomes a wraith, skin stretched tightly over bones, eyes large in a wasted face, muscles wasted, fat depots consumed. Growth falters, immunity weakens, infections take hold with ferocity. Yet, because protein intake is proportionately reduced along with calories, serum albumin levels remain near normal, edema is not prominent. Kwashiorkor, by contrast, is the betrayal of protein deficiency in the midst of calories. Here, carbohydrate is sufficient, but protein is lacking. The child appears paradoxically plump, with edema swelling the feet and belly, but it is a false fullness masking profound muscle wasting. The liver enlarges with fatty change, hair loses its color and texture, skin becomes flaky, immune function collapses. Kwashiorkor is named from a Ghanaian word meaning the sickness the older child gets when the next baby comes, a reminder of weaning onto poor starchy diets when a new sibling arrives. Between these two extremes lies a spectrum, and in all cases the consequences are dire: stunted growth, delayed milestones, impaired cognition, and heightened mortality from infections. Micronutrient deficiencies. But it is not only macronutrients that matter. Vitamins and minerals, though needed in minute amounts, are the hidden threads without which the tapestry of health unravels. Take vitamin A, essential for vision, epithelial integrity, and immune defense. Its absence is tragic. Night blindness is its earliest sign, progressing to xerophthalmia, bit-hot spots, keratomalacia, and finally blindness. The child's immune defenses collapse, and measles or diarrheal diseases claim many lives that might have been spared by a simple nutrient. Vitamin D deficiency bends bones into grotesque forms. In children, rickets bows the legs, thickens wrists, and distorts the chest into a rachitic rosary. In adults, osteomalacia softens bones, leaving them prone to fractures. Behind these changes is the failure of mineralization, born of insufficient sunlight, poor intake, or renal disease. Vitamin C, once scarce on long sea voyages, manifests its absence as scurvy, bleeding gums, loose teeth, poor wound healing, bone pain. The deficiency of ascorbic acid cripples collagen synthesis, and with it the integrity of blood vessels and connective tissue. The B-complex vitamins each weave their own clinical tale. Thiamine bone deficiency gives rise to beriberi. In its dry form, it cripples nerves, causing polyneuropathy. In its wet form, it burdens the heart with dilated cardiomyopathy and edema. In alcoholics, it produces Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, with confusion, ataxia, and memory failure. Niacin B3 deficiency is remembered by the triad of pellagra, dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia. If uncorrected, death follows, completing the grim 3DS+1. Vitamin B12 and folate deficiencies impair DNA synthesis. The result is megaloblastic anemia, with large, fragile red cells, hypersegmented neutrophils, and in B12 deficiency, demyelination of the spinal cord that leaves patients with paresthesias and paralysis. Iron, though a mineral, is perhaps the most widespread deficiency in the world. Its absence leaves behind pale, listless children and fatigued adults, their red blood cells small and pale, incapable of delivering oxygen efficiently. In women of childbearing age, iron deficiency is especially pernicious, increasing the risk of maternal death and poor pregnancy outcomes. Iodine deficiency, silent in its early stages, enlarges the thyroid into a goiter and in children produces cretinism, stunted growth, deaf mutism, intellectual disability. Here, a trace mineral makes the difference between vitality and lifelong handicap: obesity. At the opposite pole of malnutrition stands obesity, a disease of plenty, now pandemic across the globe. Where once hunger claimed millions, now excess calories ravage arteries, joints, and pancreas. Obesity is not merely an aesthetic concern, it is a pathological state characterized by excessive accumulation of adipose tissue, quantified by body mass index. Why is obesity so perilous? Because adipose tissue is not inert storage, it is metabolically active. It secretes hormones and cytokines, adipokines, that influence appetite, insulin sensitivity, and inflammation. In obesity, leptin resistance emerges, satiety signals falter, and hunger persists despite excess. Free fatty acids flood the bloodstream, impairing insulin action and fueling hepatic steatosis. Chronic inflammation smolders, laying groundwork for atherosclerosis. The consequences are manifold: type 2 diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease, stroke, osteoarthritis, sleep apnea, gallstones, certain cancers such as breast, colon, and endometrium. Obesity shortens lifespan as surely as famine, though by a different mechanism. And yet, like famine, it is entwined with social and economic forces, sedentary lifestyles, calorie-dense diets, urbanization, and marketing of processed foods. The global spread of obesity tells a tale of development gone awry, where abundance has bred a new form of malady. Consider how all these nutritional disturbances echo across medicine. A child with measles is far more likely to die if malnourished. A patient undergoing surgery heals poorly if vitamin C is lacking. A pregnant woman deficient in folate delivers a child with neural tube defects. Conversely, obesity complicates anesthesia, worsens outcomes in infections, and accelerates degenerative joint disease. Nutrition is thus not a side note, but a central determinant of health. It is the soil in which every disease is planted, either nourishing resistance or fostering vulnerability. As we close this chapter, reflect on the grand sweep we have traced. Environmental disease is not an accident of nature alone. It is the sum of our choices, our industries, our economies, our diets. The air we pollute, the metals we mine, the tobacco we smoke, the alcohol we drink, the drugs we ingest, the radiation we unleash, the food we eat, all these sculpt the contours of human health. The lesson, then, is double-edged. We are victims of our environment, yes, but we are also its architects. By altering how we live, we can lighten the burden of these diseases. Preventing obesity, fortifying foods with micronutrients, regulating industrial toxins, discouraging smoking, moderating alcohol, ensuring safety and radiation, all these lie within reach. The science is clear, the challenge is will. Thus concludes the tale of environmental and nutritional diseases, a tale where environment and human body meet, sometimes in harmony, too often in conflict. But within that conflict lies possibility, for the very knowledge of cause opens the path to prevention. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all.